They had already divided everything: the house, the accounts, the lake property that my grandfather built with his own hands on 40 acres in rural Georgia. They had divided all of it between themselves at a kitchen table I had sat at for 30 years, and not one of them had called me. Not one of them had sent a text. The first time I learned that my father's estate was being settled was when a neighbor, Mrs. Patricia Woodward, 73 years old, who had lived 3 houses down since before I was born, called me on a Wednesday evening and said, "Honey, I saw the realtor's sign go up at your daddy's place today. I just wanted to make sure you knew. I did not know. I had not known anything." And when I set the phone down on my kitchen counter that Wednesday evening and stood in the silence of my apartment in Savannah, I understood 3 things simultaneously. My father was gone and no one had told me. His estate was being distributed and no one had told me. And my brother and my sister, who had been waiting for this moment for longer than I had understood, believed I had no one. They believed I was completely, utterly alone. And that belief was the most expensive mistake they ever made. Because the next morning, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the driveway of my father's house. And everything changed. My name is Aaron Whitfield. I am 43 years old. I teach high school history in Savannah, Georgia, the same city where I grew up, the same school district where I once sat in classrooms, not unlike the ones I now stand in front of. I have a daughter named Camille, who is 14 and who has my mother's eyes and a stubbornness that comes from somewhere in the bloodline that I have not yet fully identified. I have a life that is quiet and deliberate and, as of 18 months ago, more peaceful than it has ever been. And the road to that peace ran directly through the worst and most clarifying year of my adult life. Before I tell you how it ended, I need you to know how it started. Because the ending only makes sense if you understand what was built to keep me out. But first, if you are new to the Revenge Diaries, welcome. This community is built for real stories told honestly. Stories about family and betrayal and the long, complicated road to something that actually feels like justice. Please subscribe and like this video before we go any further. And drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. I love this community, and I love knowing who is here. Now let me take you back. My father, Raymond Whitfield, was 68 years old when he died of a heart attack on a Sunday morning in April. He had been in declining health for 2 years. I knew this because I called him every Sunday, the same call we had maintained for the 15 years since I moved out, and I could hear it in his voice the way you hear weather changing, slowly and then all at once. He was a proud man, a private man, a man who had built things with his hands and his patience and who had loved, in the specific way of men who do not easily say the words, by being present and reliable and there. He was there for almost everything. And then one Sunday I called and a stranger answered his phone and told me that Raymond Whitfield had been taken by ambulance to the hospital Friday evening and that he had passed away Saturday night and that his family had been notified. His family. Not me. His family. I want to explain something about my family before I go any further, because without this context, nothing else makes sense. My brother Marcus is 47. My sister Denise is 45. I am the youngest. And for reasons that are both complicated and simple, complicated in the way family psychology is always complicated, and simple in the way that favoritism is always simple, I was the one who existed on the margin of our family's inner circle for most of my life, not excluded exactly, not treated badly in ways that were easy to point to and name, but consistently, reliably, slightly outside the radius of the warmth that Marcus and Denise shared with each other and with my parents. I was the quiet one, the bookish one, the one who left for college and did not come back the same way they had come back. And somewhere in the years I was away, becoming myself, a distance had been solidified that I had always attributed to personality differences and geographical drift, but that I understood, standing in my kitchen on that Wednesday evening, was something more intentional than that. Marcus had a construction company in Augusta. He was loud and capable, and had his father's face and his mother's ability to make a room feel warmer just by entering it. Denise was a property manager in Atlanta, organized, strategic, and possessed of the specific intelligence that knows how to make decisions look inevitable rather than chosen. They had always been close. They had always operated, when it came to family business, as a unit. And they had both been present, I would later learn, at my father's bedside in the hospital, both of them there. Neither of them calling me. For 31 hours while my father moved from critical to gone, Neither of them picked up a phone and called their youngest sibling. And I want to be careful here about how I say what I need to say next, because the question of whether that was intentional, whether it was a decision made or simply an omission that happened in the disorientation of crisis, is a question I sat with for a long time. And the answer I arrived at is the reason the black SUV matters. I drove to Millbrook, the town where I grew up, 45 minutes northwest of Savannah, the morning after Mrs. Woodward's call. I did not call Marcus or Denise first. I drove the road I had driven 1,000 times, past the pine stands and the gas station with the broken sign that had been broken since I was in high school, past the church where my parents had gotten married, and I pulled up to my father's house, the house where I had grown up, where I had learned to ride a bike on the cracked driveway, where the kitchen table had seen 30 years of Sunday dinners, and I sat in my car and I looked at the realtor's sign. It was from a company in Augusta, Marcus's city. It had been planted in the front yard with the casual efficiency of something that had been arranged in advance. I went to the door and knocked, and Marcus answered. He looked at me the way you look at something that has arrived earlier than expected, not surprised exactly, more like recalculating. He said, "Aaron," I said. "When did Dad die, Marcus?" Not a question, a line drawn in the air between us. He said, "Saturday night." "We've been handling things." I said, "You've been handling things?" He said, "There's a lot to do. The estate, the property, everything. We figured you'd understand." I looked at my brother in the doorway of my father's house and I said, "Show me the will." He said the attorney was handling it. I said, "Show me the will, Marcus." And he said, "Aaron, Dad wanted things to be simple." You know how he was, and something in the way he said it, practiced, almost rehearsed, the specific cadence of a sentence prepared for this exact moment, told me that I had been right about the intention. This had not been an omission. This had been a plan. I did not go inside. I drove back to Savannah, and I called the one person I should have called before I ever drove to Millbrook. I called my father's attorney. His name was Franklin Osei, and he had been my father's attorney for 11 years. And when I told him who I was, he said, without hesitation, "Aaron, I have been hoping you would call." Those 7 words, "I have been hoping you would call." They rearranged something in my chest, because they meant Franklin Osei had something to say and had been waiting for me to create the opening. And what he told me in the next 20 minutes on that phone call was the thing that changed everything. My father had updated his will 6 months before he died. Not in the way Marcus and Denise had presented things, not a simple division between the two of them. In the updated document, the estate was divided 3 ways, equally a house. The lake property, the investment accounts my father had quietly and patiently built over 40 years, all of it 3 ways. But there was a problem. Franklin Osei had not been the attorney of record for the probate filing. Someone else had filed. Someone had gone to the probate court with a different document, an older version of the will, one that predated my father's final update, one that did not include me in the distribution, and had begun the estate process using that version. Franklin did not yet know how this had happened, but he knew it was not right. And he said, "Aaron, I think you need an attorney. And I think you need to move quickly. I want to stop here and ask you something directly, because this is the moment in the story where everything pivots. You have just found out that your brother and sister filed a fraudulent probate using an outdated will while you sat in Savannah not knowing your father had died. What do you do next? Do you call them? Do you drive back and confront them? Do you wait? I want to know your instinct because mine surprised me. Drop it in the comments right now. And while you were down there, have you ever trusted someone completely, believed they were on your side, and then found out they had been working against you the whole time? Tell me your story. This community sees you. I called a probate litigation attorney in Savannah named Carolyn Vance, who had been recommended to me by a colleague whose family had gone through an estate dispute 3 years earlier. Carolyn was 51 years old, precise in the way of someone who has spent decades in rooms where imprecision is expensive. And when I finished laying out the situation, she said, "Tell me about this AUV." I said, "What is AUV?" She said, "The one you are going to need." And then she smiled, the first time she had smiled in the entire call, and she said, "Let's talk about what we do first." I want to stop here and ask you something directly, because this is the moment in the story where everything pivots. You have just found out that your brother and sister filed a fraudulent probate using an outdated will while you sat in Savannah not knowing your father had died. What do you do next? Do you call them? Do you drive back and confront them? Do you wait? I want to know your instinct because mine surprised me. Drop it in the comments right now. And while you were down there, have you ever trusted someone completely, believed they were on your side, and then found out they had been working against you the whole time? Tell me your story. This community sees you. I called a probate litigation attorney in Savannah named Carolyn Vance, who had been recommended to me by a colleague whose family had gone through an estate dispute 3 years earlier. Carolyn was 51 years old, precise in the way of someone who has spent decades in rooms where imprecision is expensive. And when I finished laying out the situation, she said, "Tell me about this AUV." I said, "What is AUV?" She said, "The one you are going to need." And then she smiled, the first time she had smiled in the entire call, and she said, "Let's talk about what we do first." What we did first was obtain a certified copy of the updated will from Franklin Oze's records. Franklin had a signed, dated, witnessed original. He also had records of the document's execution, the specific process my father had gone through to create and authenticate it, including notarization, which meant there was a legal trail that could not be easily contested. The older will that Marcus and Denise had submitted to the probate court was a genuine document. It was real. It had existed. It had been my father's will at one point, but it had been superseded. And submitting a superseded will to a probate court without disclosing the existence of a later valid document is not a clerical error. It is a misrepresentation with legal consequences. Carolyn filed a motion to challenge the probate proceeding within 11 days of our first call. The filing triggered a mandatory hold on the estate distribution, which meant that the house could not be sold, the accounts could not be accessed. The lake property, those 40 acres in rural Georgia that my grandfather had built, could not be transferred. Everything froze. And on the morning that the hold was served, Carolyn sent a representative from her firm's process service to my father's house to deliver the notice. The representative drove a black company SUV with tinted windows. And Marcus, who was meeting with the realtor on the front porch when it pulled into the driveway, watched it park and watched a woman in a dark jacket walk toward him with a legal envelope in her hand. And according to the process server's account, Marcus said nothing for a very long moment. He just looked at the SUV, and then he said, very quietly, "Aaron, not a question, not surprise. Just my name, recognition." He had underestimated me. He had thought I had no one. And the SUV in the driveway was the moment he understood that he had been wrong. I want to tell you what happened in the weeks after the filing, because the process matters and the details matter, and I want you to understand that what happened was not dramatic in the Hollywood sense. It was slow and methodical and expensive and at times genuinely exhausting. There were depositions. There were document requests. There were multiple hearings in the probate court before a judge who had clearly seen families do terrible things to each other over money and who listened to everything with the careful neutrality of someone who has learned not to be surprised. Denise retained her own attorney. Marcus retained a separate attorney. Carolyn and I sat across from both of them in a conference room on a Wednesday afternoon in June, and I looked at my brother and my sister, people I had grown up with, people who had been present at my father's death while I was not informed, people who had filed a court document knowing it was not the most current expression of my father's wishes, and I felt something I want to describe accurately. It was not rage. It was something colder and more useful than rage. It was clarity. The absolute, complete clarity of a person who finally understands the full shape of what they have been living inside. The key evidentiary moment came not from Carolyn's filings, but from something I found in my father's house during an inspection visit my attorney arranged through the court. A court-ordered inventory of estate assets required a walkthrough of the property, and I was permitted to attend as an interested party. I went through every room. I was looking for documents, specifically anything that might support or contradict either version of the will. What I found was in the drawer of my father's bedside table. It was a handwritten letter, not a legal document, not a will. A letter dated 3 months before my father died, addressed to all three of us. In it, my father wrote about his intention to leave things equally. He wrote that he wanted no fighting. He wrote that he had updated his will with Franklin Oze to make sure things were clear. And he wrote, in his careful handwriting, "Marcus and Denise, I know you think Aaron has gone his own way, but he is your brother. And what I am leaving is for all three of you. Please do not make this hard. Please do not make this hard." My father had known. He had anticipated this. He had written it down. And they had done it anyway. Carolyn entered the letter into evidence. It was not legally binding, it was not a will or a codicil, but it was a statement of intent from the deceased that supported the updated document Franklin held and that directly contradicted the narrative Marcus and Denise had presented. Their attorney tried to argue that the letter was ambiguous. The judge looked at the letter for a long time and then looked at the attorney and said, "I have read this letter 3 times. I do not find it ambiguous," and that was the turning point. I felt it in the room the moment she said it, a shift in atmospheric pressure, like a window opening somewhere. The ruling came 6 weeks after the final hearing. The updated will was recognized as the valid testamentary document. The probate proceeding initiated with the older document was voided. The estate was to be distributed equally among all 3 children, the house, the accounts, the lake property. 3 ways, exactly as my father had intended. Exactly as he had written it down 3 months before he died. Exactly as he had asked them not to complicate. The judge also noted in the written ruling that the submission of the superseded document without disclosure of the updated version represented a serious concern that she was referring to the state bar for review in connection with the attorney who had filed it. I did not know, until that moment, that Marcus and Denise had used an attorney to file the original probate. I had assumed they had done it themselves. Finding out there had been professional assistance in what the judge considered a serious concern, that was its own additional revelation. I want to tell you about the day I went to the lake property for the first time after everything was settled. It was a Saturday in October, about 3 months after the ruling. I drove out alone. Camille was with her mother that weekend, and I wanted this one to myself. 45 acres in rural Georgia, the land my grandfather had cleared, and the dock he had built on the water's edge, and the small cabin that had been standing since the 1970s, and that smelled when I pushed the door open, like pine and old wood, and something I could not name that was simply the smell of time accumulated in a place. I walked down to the dock. I sat on the edge with my feet hanging over the water. The trees were starting to turn, just the edges, the first suggestion of fall, and the water was very still, and the air had that particular October quality of things pausing before the cold arrives. And I thought about my father. Not about the estate or the filing or the ruling, about him. About the Sunday phone calls, about the way he said goodbye at the end of every one. "Love you, son." 3 words he said consistently regardless of what the call had contained, regardless of what we had disagreed about or laughed about or simply sat with in comfortable quiet. I thought about him knowing, 3 months before he died, that Marcus and Denise might complicate what he was leaving, and choosing to write it down anyway, choosing to be clear anyway, trusting that clarity would eventually find its way through. It had found its way through, not easily, not without cost, but it had. The second engagement I want to offer you before we get to the ending is this. I have been thinking about what my father understood that I did not. He knew his children. He knew Marcus's capacity for decisiveness in his own favor. He knew Denise's organizational intelligence and how it could be turned to purposes that looked like practicality and were actually something else. And he had arranged things with Franklin Assay and written the letter in the bedside drawer as a kind of protection he could offer from beyond whatever came next. Which brings me to something I want to ask you. Have you ever had someone in your life build a protection for you before they knew you would need it? Someone who saw something coming that you could not yet see? Drop that in the comments, because the responses to questions like that in this community are some of the most meaningful things I read. I want to tell you about the day I went to the lake property for the first time after everything was settled. It was a Saturday in October, about 3 months after the ruling. I drove out alone. Camille was with her mother that weekend, and I wanted this one to myself. 45 acres in rural Georgia, the land my grandfather had cleared, and the dock he had built on the water's edge, and the small cabin that had been standing since the 1970s, and that smelled when I pushed the door open, like pine and old wood, and something I could not name that was simply the smell of time accumulated in a place. I walked down to the dock. I sat on the edge with my feet hanging over the water. The trees were starting to turn, just the edges, the first suggestion of fall, and the water was very still, and the air had that particular October quality of things pausing before the cold arrives. And I thought about my father. Not about the estate or the filing or the ruling, about him. About the Sunday phone calls, about the way he said goodbye at the end of every one. "Love you, son." 3 words he said consistently regardless of what the call had contained, regardless of what we had disagreed about or laughed about or simply sat with in comfortable quiet. I thought about him knowing 3 months before he died that Marcus and Denise might complicate what he was leaving, and choosing to write it down anyway, choosing to be clear anyway, trusting that clarity would eventually find its way through. It had found its way through, not easily, not without cost, but it had. The second engagement I want to offer you before we get to the ending is this. I have been thinking about what my father understood that I did not. He knew his children. He knew Marcus's capacity for decisiveness in his own favor. He knew Denise's organizational intelligence and how it could be turned to purposes that looked like practicality and were actually something else. And he had arranged things with Franklin Assay and written the letter in the bedside drawer as a kind of protection he could offer from beyond whatever came next. Which brings me to something I want to ask you. Have you ever had someone in your life build a protection for you before they knew you would need it? Someone who saw something coming that you could not yet see? Drop that in the comments, because the responses to questions like that in this community are some of the most meaningful things I read. Marcus and I have not spoken since the ruling. This is not something I have decided permanently. I believe in the possibility of things changing, because I have seen things change in ways I did not expect. And refusing that possibility costs me something I am not willing to pay. But right now, in the current chapter, we do not speak. Denise and I have had one conversation. She called me about 2 months after the ruling, not to apologize, not exactly, but to say something that I think was the closest she could get to an acknowledgement. She said, I convinced myself it was practical, that you had your own life and wouldn't want to deal with all of it. I said, Denise, you knew about the updated will. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, yes, just that, one word. The first honest thing she had said to me in a very long time. I said, okay, and we hung up. And I have been deciding what to do with that one-word honesty ever since. My share of the estate allowed me to pay off my car, establish a college fund for Camille that I feel genuinely good about, and purchase a piece of property on the edge of Savannah that I have been slowly, patiently making into something. Not quickly, not all at once. And the way my father built things, with time and patience and the specific satisfaction of work done correctly, I go out there on weekends. Camille comes sometimes and walks the perimeter with me, asking questions about what it is going to look like, and I tell her what I am thinking, and she has opinions that she is not shy about sharing. She is 14 and entirely herself. There is nothing in the world I am more proud of. Here's what I want to leave you with, because I have been thinking about it since before I started telling you this story, and I want to say it correctly. The black SUV in the driveway was not the revenge. I want to be clear about that. It was a symbol, a moment when something shifted, when my brother understood that the calculation he had made about my isolation was wrong. But the actual work, the actual turning of the tide, was quieter and less cinematic than a tinted window SUV at a contested property. It was Franklin Assay waiting for my call. It was Carolyn Vance filing in 11 days. It was a letter in a bedside drawer written by a man who knew his children well enough to prepare for them. It was a judge reading that letter 3 times and deciding it was not ambiguous. The real work was done in offices and courtrooms and the patience required to let a legal process arrive at its own conclusion without trying to force it into something faster or more dramatic. That patience was the hardest part, and it was the most important part. My father was right. The truth found its way to the surface, not because I was powerful or well-connected or lucky, because it was the truth. And the truth, when you have documentation and the right people standing with you and the willingness to wait for the process that exists. For exactly this purpose, the truth has a way of arriving, maybe not as fast as you want, maybe not as cleanly as you imagined, but it arrives. It arrives the way the CUV arrived on a morning when the people who thought you had no one discovered all at once that they were wrong. If this story gave you something, a reminder, a recognition, something that shifted, please like this video, subscribe to the Revenge Diaries, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. There are people watching right now who are in the middle of their own version of this, who are sitting in an apartment somewhere being told, implicitly or explicitly, that they have no one, who have not yet made the call, who have not yet understood that the protection their person left them is still there, waiting to be claimed. This one is for them. And if that is you, make the call. The truth is still there, and it will find its way to the surface. I promise you that. I will see you in the next one.